Hello, everybody. I just wanted to make a short revision video here for you guys to watch on development economics. I'm going to make this video and then I'll make another one, a very short one on the market intervention for you guys as well. But this one is just an overview of development economics. And first of all, I just want to say under your documents, I've added the following things. So of course, you all know where you can find the different chapter notes. I'm going to add something on chapter 33 as well. Under your class plan, you can see the our class plan here is links to different videos, YouTube articles, or sorry, videos and articles to be good revision for you as well. And then I just want to bring your attention to this learning guide. This is the IB official learning guide, the economics guide. I just want to go through it for development economics, the different things. So for development economics, we've gone through quite quick these different topics here: economic development, measuring development, the role of domestic factors and trade, the role of foreign direct investment. Today we've discussed aid. We briefly got talking about international debt. I'll say a bit more about that here. And then this is what's coming in the next video. So just to go through a kind of revision, what do you need to remember for, or what is it you need to be focused on for development? So let's just go down here. So remember, development is closely related to macroeconomics, the tools that we use in macro and also the PPCs. That is our diagrams we use in development economics. Really, for diagrams, you need to know how the PPC, basically things like FDI, more investment, aid, etc. These should shift the PPC curve outwards. So you should drive some sort of long-term growth. But also in the short term, what these things like an increase in FDI or an increase in aid do? Well, it impacts the supply and demand, the aggregate supply and aggregate demand. In the short term, it should boost aggregate demand in an economy because you've got more income, people can demand more stuff. But in the long term, it should shift out your long run aggregate supply curve. So essentially, you just need to know that these things, aid, aid, investment, etc., they'll boost demand and boost supply in an economy. You need to be able to illustrate that in diagrams. So very quickly, let's go through the different things that you need to know on aid. 4.1, we talked about economic growth and economic development. We distinguish between the two. So economic growth is just more or less GDP growing. So positive growth rates of GDP. Economic development is much more. It's society developing. It's looking at the health, the education level. It's looking at gender equality. It's looking at the sustainable development goals, for example. It's not just focused on GDP growth. So make sure you have some example. Are you ready to? You've got some examples of how we can measure economic development, and we'll talk more about that later. So you'll be explaining the multidimensional nature of economic development. It's not just increasing GDP, as we said. It's about raising living standards. It's about getting rid of poverty. It's about reducing inequalities and increasing employment opportunities. The most important sources of economic growth in economically less developed countries include increases in quantity of physical and human capital, development and the use of new technologies that are appropriate to the condition of the economically less developed countries and institutional changes. Essentially, for a lot of developing countries, it's just about getting more capital, getting more finance in, for example, so that business people, entrepreneurs can take advantage of the opportunities that these countries have. A lot of the so-called poor, a lot of the poorer countries are rich in natural resources. They have a lot of commodities. Africa has got so much wealth, but it hasn't got the other resources needed to take advantage of this, such as capital, such as expertise, and so on. You need to be able to know the relationship or understand the relationship between growth and development. So the harsh reality is that only limited economic development is possible in the absence of economic growth. So you need economic growth in order to properly develop. But basically, economic growth may not lead to economic development. So economic growth is necessary over the long term for development, but it doesn't necessarily, but it's not sufficient to guarantee that we have economic development. Common characteristics of less developed countries. So these next two parts, developed countries, a lot of them have the same characteristics, but at the same time, there's no one developed country the same. So in terms of some of the characteristics they share, it just comes down here. I mean, describing them: low GDP per capita, high levels of poverty, large agricultural sector. So the large agricultural sector is basically saying they're too dependent on agriculture because they haven't developed their manufacturing, they haven't developed their service sector. Large urban informal sectors, so basically a lot of black markets, and high birth rates. So they haven't got, you know, the high birth rates, people having, I guess, more kids than they can afford. Is that fair to say? Or basically they haven't got the fertility rates that we see in the Western world, or Japan or Korea and so on, which you can argue are far too low because we're not replacing our population. Explain in some countries that there may be communities caught in the poverty trap, where poor communities are unable to invest in physical, human, and natural capital due to low or no savings. Poverty is therefore transmitted from generation to generation. So remember the poverty cycle, the poverty trap. So low growth leads to low GDP, leads to low saving, low investment, and the cycle just gets repeated. So be able to explain that there. Then this next point, diversity among economically less developed nations. So they're also different. Some countries are developing because of, some countries have lots of resources, others have challenges with climate, others have, been colonized through their history, and then the political systems can be different as well. Then the last part there, just know, I don't think they should ask about the Millennium Development Goals because they no longer exist, but just know some of the ideas around the Sustainable Development Goals. There's 17 of them, the things they cover. Have one that you're the master of. Understand that we're progressing on these, but progress is not moving as fast as what we would like it to be. In terms of measuring development, I'm going to start going through this quickly now. Just understand the different parts of GDP. So GDP per person, just GDP per capita. Know the difference between GDP and GNI. Know why do we calculate GDP at purchasing power parity exchange rates, i.e. we want to understand when we adjust for purchasing power, how do the countries compare? Compare and contrast, and this is more about GDP. So how do we measure growth and development? We can use what we call these single indicators, the GDP, the other income measures. We can compare health indicators, we can compare education indicators, but more and more we're looking at these, what we call composite indicators, and the most famous one is the Human Development Index. It combines income, health, and education to give us one measure of how we can rank countries in terms of development. This is a really interesting one. Why do some countries have a higher ranking on their GDP than on their HDI? On the rich end, US is a very famous example here. Highest GDP overall, GDP per capita very high. The HDI is still quite high, but not as impressive as the GDP per capita. What's happening there? Health, education, think a bit those things. 4.3 is very, very clear. What can an economy do themselves? What can a society do to ensure their development? What should they have in place? Some of the most important factors education and health. You have smart, educated smart workers, healthy workers. It's going to help your long-term growth. If you're able to use technology the right technology to develop your society, your factors of reduction, it's going to benefit society. If you've got a proper banking and financial system, if all businesses have access to credit, this is going to benefit. Generally speaking, if you empower your society, women, minorities, etc., if these are all empowered, society becomes more developed. And then also with income distribution as well. Role of international trade. Here, this part here just talks about lots of developing countries face this, they face these typical problems when they in trade. So they have no real market power. They just get dominated on the international stage when it comes to trade. They tend to be specialized on a narrow range of products. Look at Nigeria. It was growing quite up well until 2014. Oil exporter. Once the oil prices fell, it was big trouble. Lots of big projects, a lot of development projects had to stop over there. They focus on primary products, which has the most price volatility. They are very restricted in how they can access the international markets. They don't have any pricing power, for example. How can countries, what sort of trade strategies can they use to develop? And there's different ones here, import substitution. This is used by a lot of developing countries at the start, where they kind of, rather than import from abroad, they build up their own domestic industries to get so for strategic reasons, get some strong domestic champions, promoting exports, free trade. So the economic consensus is free trade will benefit all countries, especially those who are developing and so on. It'll give them greater access to markets. It means they're able to import goods much cheaper as well. We get the role of the WTO. What role do they play? You just need to know that they should be there to help the smaller countries not getting cheated in the international markets. And then, I think diversification is a good strategy. If you look at a country like, even say, a rich oil country like Saudi Arabia, they're trying to diversify away from just oil and into a wider range of products. Next chapter then about foreign direct investment. Here, just know how FDI can benefit a society, know the definitions, know what multinational corporations are, and be able to discuss the advantages and disadvantages of these. So FDI does help less developed economies. However, it does also create its own problems. Profits being sent out of the country and so on. Poor countries essentially encouraged to have bad labor standards just so they can win the deals and so on. We just talked about this here on aid today. I'm not going to go through this, but you can just look at yourself in the reading guide, know the different definitions of aid, etc. And then here, be able to say how well aid has done. Say aid doesn't work too well, try to give some reasons, as we discussed in class today, why aid doesn't work so well. And then here, we just started talking about this here today. Countries, if you have a lot, the bottom line is if a country has a lot of debt, they have to pay back a lot of interest. This is a problem. And then if they're doing this as well, sometimes they get helped out by what we call the IMF and the World Bank. Now, the IMF and the World Bank, they will say their purpose is to help these countries, but the challenge is they put a lot of rules and regulations on these countries. And essentially they are telling these countries, set up your economy the same way Western economies are. Challenge here is it's one size doesn't fit all, and it can often lead to very, very tough situations for the developing countries. Even for developed countries, they did this after the last recession when they introduced austerity and so on. And then this 4.8, so the last part, I will just make a separate video on this for you guys. Okay, all right, thank you very much.